in a quiet suburb of Georgia. A single moment shattered reputations, careers, and prejudices. A police officer, arrogant, assured, and fueled by unconscious bias, stopped a black man for a so-called routine check. But what he didn't know was that the man standing calmly before him held the power to end his career in seconds. This is a story of justice seen, lived, and delivered. So let's listen to the story. Pay attention to full story to get the suspense and thrill. It was a warm, golden afternoon in the quiet suburb of Stonewood, Georgia, a town that prided itself on well-manicured lawns, two-story brick homes, and a community that looks after its own. But beneath that postcard image, an undercurrent of discomfort ran deep, especially when it came to race. Officer Kyle Maddox, a 12-year veteran of the Stonewood Police Department, sat in his cruiser parked along Maple Grove Road, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching cars roll by. It was a slow shift. No real calls, just silence and the occasional squirrel darting across the pavement. He liked it that way. Kyle wasn't the kind of cop looking for action. He liked control, order, predictability. Then he saw it. A sleek, black Mercedes-Benz S-Class glided down the road and pulled into the empty community park. The car was polished, spotless, clearly expensive. Inside, a black man sat behind the wheel, alone, calm, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit and silver tie. He parked neatly near the trailhead and pulled out what looked like a leather-bound journal. No laws were broken. No calls had been made. There was nothing suspicious, except to Kyle. He narrowed his eyes. "What's a guy like that doing in a neighborhood like this?" he muttered to himself. With a quick flick of the switch, Kyle activated his lights and pulled into the parking lot behind a Mercedes. The sirens weren't necessary, but he flipped them briefly anyway, just to send a message. Inside the car, Jordan Colton sat still. He calmly placed the journal on the passenger seat, turned off the ignition, and positioned both hands clearly on the wheel, fingers spread, palms visible. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because in America, black men are taught from a young age how to survive police encounters. Kyle approached the car like a man entering a war zone, hand already resting on his holster. License and registration. The words came fast, clipped, not as a question but a demand. Jordan turned slowly and met the officer's eyes through the open window. "Certainly, officer. May I ask the reason for the stop?" That question, simple, calm, and polite, was enough to snap something in Kyle. How dare this man question him? In Kyle's mind, authority wasn't to be challenged, especially not by someone like him. Out of the car. Now, Kyle's hand slid down to unclip his holster. Jordan blinked. "Sir, I'm happy to comply. Just please, tell me why I'm being—" "I said get out of the CAR." Kyle barked, drawing his gun. Jordan slowly exited, hands raised. Around them, joggers stopped. Parents with strollers paused. A few bystanders began filming on their phones. The scene was unfolding in broad daylight, but Kyle didn't seem to care. He was locked in, eyes narrowed, gun raised, adrenaline flowing. "Down on your knees. Hands behind your head." Jordan complied, every motion careful, deliberate. He knew the statistics. He knew how quickly a movement could be misinterpreted. As Kyle cuffed him tightly, Jordan didn't resist. He didn't argue, but he said something that made Kyle laugh. "You're making a terrible mistake." Kyle scoffed. "I don't make mistakes. Now let's see what you're really hiding." He searched the car without consent, found nothing. He patted down Jordan, found nothing. Still, he tossed him in the back seat of the cruiser, like a criminal. "You fit the description," Kyle muttered to the onlookers. But he never said what the description was. Inside the cruiser, Jordan stared straight ahead, not fearful, but deeply disappointed. Not just in Kyle, but in a system that made this moment possible. This wasn't his first time being profiled, but it might be the most ironic. As they pulled into the Stonewood precinct, Kyle radioed in, bringing in a possible 10 to 16, resisting stop. "Will confirm ID inside." Back at the station, Jordan was processed like any other detainee. No name, no recognition, no benefit of the doubt. Kyle still hadn't run his ID. He was too caught up in being the hero of his own story. As Jordan sat in the holding cell, hands bruised from the cuffs, suit wrinkled, dignity intact, he waited, not for revenge, but for reality to crash in. Meanwhile, in the precinct's digital database, a flag pinged red. State alert. Attorney General of Georgia, Jordan Edward Colton. It took less than 5 seconds for the supervisor to sprint down the hallway toward holding. The color drained from his face as he looked into the cell. Oh my God, get those cuffs off him. Now. Maddox arrived seconds later, confused. What's going on? The supervisor turned, red with panic. That man you arrested? That's Jordan Colton, our state attorney general. Kyle's mouth fell open. Everything stopped. The police station was unusually quiet as Officer Kyle Maddox returned from processing the man he had arrested, still smug, still confident that he'd done his job. He slapped the arrest report onto the front desk, cracked his knuckles, and sat back with a sense of self-satisfaction. In his eyes, he'd just stopped a suspicious individual, taught him a lesson, and reinforced law and order. What he didn't realize was that he had just tossed a match into a room, soaked in gasoline. Down the hall, behind locked doors and surveillance cameras, Jordan Colton sat in a holding cell, wrists sore from the overly tight handcuffs. He rubbed the red marks on his skin, but his mind wasn't on the pain. It was on the principles. He had just experienced firsthand the very system he had vowed to reform. The irony wasn't lost on him. Jordan wasn't a man who clung to his titles. In fact, he avoided using his power to gain personal advantage. But this wasn't about him anymore. It was about the message, about the rot inside the walls of justice. Meanwhile, at the main desk, the officer on shift, Officer Ramirez, pulled up the arrested man's file to finalize the booking. The moment she typed in the name, Jordan E. Colton, from his driver's license, a red flag flashed across her screen. Statewide security match. Do not detain. Highest priority. Identified. State Attorney General of Georgia, Jordan Edward Colton. Ramirez froze. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard like they'd just touched fire. She reread the alert 3 times. Then the room erupted into a storm of panic. Chief, you need to see this right now. The chief of police, an older, seasoned man named Benjamin Rourke, rushed over. His jaw clenched as he read the screen. His voice dropped into a harsh whisper. Get him out of that cell. Now. I want Maddox in my office immediately. Within minutes, 2 officers hurried down the hall toward the holding cells. Jordan looked up as the door creaked open. Mr. Colton, sir, we sincerely apologize. Please come with us. He stood slowly, brushing the dust from his suit jacket. The officers avoided eye contact as they unshackled him. The hallway was now lined with staff, some confused, some stunned, a few embarrassed. Word spread like wildfire. In the main room, Kyle Maddox sat in the chief's office, still oblivious to the fire he'd lit. Chief Rourke walked in, and behind him stood Jordan Colton, calm, collected, but radiating an undeniable authority. Kyle's face drained of color. His voice faltered. Well, what's going on? Jordan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Chief Rourke turned to Kyle with steel in his voice. You arrested the state attorney general. No probable cause. No reason. No due process. You pointed a weapon at one of the highest-ranking officials in the state and humiliated him in public. Kyle's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, 1,000 judgments pressing down on him like a collapsing roof. Jordan finally stepped forward, calm as ever. You never asked who I was. Never gave me a chance to speak. You saw a black man in a suit and assumed criminality. You drew your weapon before you asked a single question. You used your badge as a weapon of fear, not justice. The silence in the room was deafening. Jordan wasn't raising his voice, but the power in his words hit like thunder. This isn't about ego, Officer Maddox. It's about culture. A culture where bias is standard procedure, where suspicion replaces evidence, where skin color is mistaken for probable cause. The chief lowered his head. Even he couldn't deny what had happened. The facts were indisputable. And worse, it was all caught on camera. And the world was about to see it. Because out in the parking lot of that peaceful park earlier that day, Dozens of people had been recording. The footage had already hit social media. By the time Jordan stepped out of that station, the video had over 750,000 views and was climbing by the minute. On TikTok, a young woman had posted, "Black man pulled out of a Mercedes at gunpoint for sitting in a park. Just learned he's the state attorney general. This is why we say the system is broken." The internet erupted. Hashtag AG Colton trended on Twitter within an hour. Major news networks picked it up by sunset. CNN, MSNBC, even conservative networks scrambled to catch up. It wasn't just a racial profiling incident. It was the arrest of one of the most powerful legal figures in the state by someone sworn to uphold the law. Meanwhile, Jordan sat quietly in a back room at the station, sipping water, his phone lighting up nonstop. Aides, journalists, civil rights leaders, even the governor had called, but he ignored most of them. Instead, he called his mother. "I'm okay," he told her, "but I need to make sure the next person this happens to isn't forgotten." Back in the chief's office, Kyle Maddox was suspended on the spot. Badge turned in. Gun surrendered. Rourke said nothing more. The shame was written all over Kyle's face. He had misjudged a man who could have destroyed him with a phone call. But Jordan didn't need revenge. He had something more powerful. Truth. And now the truth was out. The story had already begun to take on a life of its own, fueled not by vengeance, but by purpose. By dawn the next morning, the world had changed, not just for Officer Kyle Maddox, or even for Attorney General Jordan Colton, but for the entire state of Georgia and beyond. What began as a routine stop-turned-racial spectacle had ignited a digital inferno. The video, 2 minutes and 47 seconds of raw, silent footage, had now been viewed over 6 million times. In it, viewers saw the precise moment Maddox pulled his weapon on a man doing absolutely nothing. They saw Jordan's calm. They saw Maddox's aggression. But most of all, they saw what racial bias looked like in real time. And then came the second wave, the revelation of Jordan Colton's identity. America didn't know whether to scream in outrage or disbelief. The arrest of the state attorney general, one of the highest legal authorities in Georgia, by a small-town patrol officer with a history of complaints, became a lightning rod for every conversation the country had been avoiding for years. By 9 a.m., every major network had set up outside the Capitol building in Atlanta. The podium was simple. A small Georgia flag on one side, the American flag on the other. Dozens of microphones glinted in the morning sun. When Jordan stepped out, flanked by 2 aides, the cameras exploded. Reporters shouted questions. Flashbulbs popped. But Jordan didn't raise his hand for silence. He just walked forward and began speaking with the same calm, commanding voice he'd used in courtrooms, committee hearings, and now viral videos. "Good morning," he began. "As most of you know, yesterday I was detained by a police officer in Stonewood, Georgia. I was arrested at gunpoint, without cause, without explanation, and without dignity." The crowd leaned in. Reporters froze, pens halfway to paper. This is not the first time I have been profiled, and it will not be the last. But this time, I had a badge of my own. I had a title that eventually protected me. But ask yourself, what would have happened if I didn't? Silence blanketed the crowd. This moment is not about me. It is about every father who got pulled over for fitting the description. Every teenager thrown to the ground for looking suspicious. Every black woman told to calm down after asking a question. This story is bigger than a headline. It is a mirror, and it is reflecting something ugly. Behind him, a massive digital screen flickered on, showing the footage, frame by frame. Maddox drawing his weapon, Jordan calmly complying. The handcuffs, the walk of shame. Jordan didn't flinch as his own humiliation played out on screen. You're watching a black man being treated like a suspect simply for existing. But what makes this different is who I am. Because yesterday, the system mistook a man within it as a man beneath it. Gasps echoed from some in the press row. Now let me be clear. This is not an attack on every officer. I know good police. I've worked with them. I've fought beside them in court. But good cops do not make broken systems whole. They simply exist within them. He paused. I am calling for a full review of the Stonewood Police Department. Every stop, every complaint, every use of force. But that is just the beginning. Jordan leaned into the mic slightly, voice sharper. I will be launching a statewide initiative to reform policing standards, mandatory de-escalation training, racial bias evaluations and recruitment, civilian review boards with binding power, live body cam feed storage to an independent cloud system, and most of all, a public reporting system for every interaction, not just arrests. Reporters scribbled furiously. Social media lit up. This is not about vengeance. Officer Maddox will be given due process, something I was denied. That line hit like a sledgehammer. But justice, true justice, requires more than discipline. It requires change. It requires honesty. And it requires America to stop pretending this isn't real. Some in the crowd began clapping, quietly at first, then louder, until the entire press gallery was standing. Not out of politeness, out of sheer emotional gravity. But Jordan wasn't done. We live in a nation that tells black boys to just comply, as if that's a shield from bullets. That tells black women to watch their tone, as if safety comes from silence. That tells people like me to stay humble, while stripping away our humanity. He looked directly into the camera. I was arrested at gunpoint in the neighborhood I helped protect. I was treated like a threat when I am a guardian of the law. That is the sickness, and I intend to be part of the cure. He stepped back, didn't take questions, didn't bask in applause. He just nodded once and walked away. In the following hours, his speech was played in full across national networks. TikTok creators broke it down line by line. Twitter threads praised his poise. Instagram pages posted side-by-side images of him in handcuffs, and then behind the podium, both haunting, both powerful. Even conservatives who usually railed against identity politics were quiet, because there was nothing to argue with here. The video didn't lie. The calm in Jordan's voice made the rage in America even more real. Students in classrooms watched the press conference as part of spontaneous discussions on systemic racism. Police departments began internal reviews, not because they were told to, but because they were afraid they might be next. One moment, one arrest, one man, and a nation forced to look itself in the mirror. The fallout from the press conference was immediate and deafening. Within 24 hours, Stonewood city phone lines were overwhelmed. Emails flooded in from activists, reporters, state lawmakers, and everyday citizens demanding answers. National civil rights organizations announced protests, rallies, and campaigns aimed directly at the Stonewood Police Department and their long-ignored pattern of racial profiling. But inside the department walls, chaos reigned. Officer Kyle Maddox sat in a cold internal affairs conference room, stripped of his badge, his gun, and his pride. He wasn't wearing a uniform anymore, just plain clothes and a growing sense of dread. A legal advisor sat across from him with a thick stack of reports. His disciplinary history, complaints he thought were buried, dashcam footage that never made the public record. But now, everything was coming to light. Maddox had become the face of America's worst fear, a badge with a bias. In the corner of the room, a television played the clip from the press conference on loop. Jordan Colton's voice echoed from the screen. Justice requires more than discipline. It requires change, honesty, and accountability. Maddox couldn't escape it. He tried to tell himself that it was overblown, that he was just doing his job, that he wasn't racist. But in his heart, even he knew those were lies. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't explain the stop. He drew his weapon like it was instinct, because it was. And that was the problem. Meanwhile, the state capitol, Attorney General Colton had already begun his next move. He wasn't satisfied with just being a viral story. He wanted permanent reform, real consequences, systemic rewiring. The first thing he did was create a task force of independent legal experts, civil rights lawyers, and former officers, all committed to redesigning policing standards from the ground up. The task force had one mission: end qualified immunity abuse, create enforceable checks on power, restore public trust. Colton knew it wouldn't be easy. The police union pushed back hard, calling his proposals radical and anti-law enforcement. Some conservative pundits accused him of waging war on the badge. But Jordan didn't flinch. He wasn't trying to tear down law enforcement. He was trying to save it from itself. Stonewood's mayor, pressured by local outrage, resigned within days. The police chief, who once called Jordan sir behind closed doors, he stepped down in shame. And the city council voted unanimously to create a civilian oversight board with subpoena power. Across the state, other cities began to examine their own departments. Complaints that had once been ignored were suddenly reopened. Officers previously protected by silence were finally under investigation. One by one, the dominoes fell. But for Jordan, this wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. Late one night, a young officer, Officer Layla Johnson, stood outside Jordan's office. She'd watched the video. She'd read every word of the press conference. And as one of the only black women on her force, she felt both pride and fear. Pride in Jordan's courage. Fear that her department would now turn against her for standing with him. She knocked. Jordan looked up from his desk and smiled gently. "Come in, Officer Johnson. I know you." She nodded nervously. I wanted to thank you for speaking up, for making space for officers like me who want to do right, but are afraid of being silenced by the wrong ones." Jordan stood. "You don't need to thank me. You need to hold the line. Because if good officers stay quiet, the bad ones keep the megaphone." Her eyes welled with tears. In that moment, she wasn't just a cop. She was a symbol of hope inside a system struggling to breathe. While reforms began taking root in Georgia, the rest of the country watched closely. Other state AGs reached out to Jordan. Cities like Chicago, Baltimore, and Los Angeles asked for his task force's findings. His speech was used as training material in multiple police academies. And perhaps most powerfully, high school and college classrooms used his case to discuss justice, bias, and power. Students debated it. Teachers dissected it. The next generation listened and questioned. America had found an unexpected leader, not because he sought fame, but because he stood still while chaos swirled and held a mirror up to a system afraid to see itself. Back in Stonewood, the man who started it all, Kyle Maddox, faced a tribunal. His lawyer tried to argue that the arrest was a misunderstanding. But the panel didn't buy it. Neither did the public. Ultimately, he was fired with prejudice, losing not just his badge, but his pension and future in law enforcement. When a reporter later caught him outside a courthouse and asked if he regretted it, Maddox didn't answer. He just looked away. Because what could he say? That same week, Jordan Colton stood before the Georgia Supreme Court and introduced the Justice Integrity Act, a statewide initiative requiring psychological evaluations every 3 years for all officers, mandatory racial bias retraining, independent prosecutors for all officer-involved shootings, a public, searchable misconduct database. The bill passed, not because lawmakers suddenly grew a conscience, but because the people, black, white, brown, stood behind Colton's mission. He had turned humiliation into legislation. He had transformed pain into policy, and he had done it without bitterness. He wasn't a victim. He was a vessel for something larger. It had been 3 months since the arrest. 3 months since a black man, parked in a quiet Georgia park, was thrown to the ground at gunpoint. 3 months since the world discovered that man was the Attorney General of the state. The headlines had faded. The protests had quieted. The cameras had moved on. But the movement had not, and neither had Jordan Colton. He no longer needed to prove his identity. America knew who he was now. But instead of fading into political comfort, he leaned harder into discomfort. He spoke at colleges, at prisons, at churches, at small-town town halls where people didn't look like him, didn't vote like him, and didn't understand what it felt like to be feared just for walking through your own neighborhood. But he didn't preach. He listened. Because justice wasn't just about policy. It was about people. One Sunday morning, he was invited to speak at a rural Baptist church in North Georgia, mostly white, deeply conservative. Many in attendance had only seen Jordan through the lens of headlines and internet clips. He arrived in navy suit, not to impress, but out of respect. As he stepped onto the modest wooden pulpit, silence filled the room. He looked out at the faces, some curious, some skeptical, a few openly resistant, and then he began. 3 months ago, I was arrested at gunpoint while doing absolutely nothing wrong. Many of you saw that video. Many of you might have thought, well, maybe there's more to the story. I don't blame you. That's what we're conditioned to do, to assume that power protects the innocent, and that people who look like me must have done something to deserve the treatment they get. He paused. But I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here because I want something from you. The room shifted. Eyebrows raised. I want your imagination. Murmurs rippled through the pews. Imagine if I hadn't been the Attorney General. Imagine if I didn't have a suit, or a badge, or a platform. Would I still be alive today? Would I have made it to court? Or would my mother have gotten a different kind of phone call? He took a breath. Now imagine it wasn't me. Imagine it was your son, your grandson, your neighbor. Same situation, same officer, same assumption. Do you feel differently now? The crowd was no longer shifting in discomfort. They were listening. Racism isn't always a scream. Sometimes it's a shrug, a policy, a profile, a decision made in 2 seconds that ruins a life forever. He scanned the room, slowly. And justice isn't just a courtroom verdict. It's how we treat people when no one's watching. It's the questions we ask when something doesn't sit right. It's the courage to admit when the system we love isn't loving us back. There were tears in some eyes, nods in others. One elderly woman stood at the back, hands clasped, whispering him in. That afternoon, his speech went viral again, but not because it was dramatic. It was human. It was the kind of honesty America rarely saw from public officials. Not anger, not performance. Truth, wrapped in humility. In the weeks that followed, Jordan's message spread far beyond Georgia. Police departments in other states adopted his reforms. Schools requested his curriculum on justice and race. Officers who had once felt threatened by his speech now sat in training sessions designed by his task force. Even some of his critics began to admit he wasn't trying to destroy law enforcement. He was trying to rebuild its soul. And slowly, something started to shift. A young officer in Wisconsin de-escalated a tense situation because she remembered what Jordan said about empathy. A school principal in Alabama created a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling after watching Jordan's press conference with his staff. A father in Mississippi told his teenage black son, "You see that man? That's how you stand tall without raising your voice." But for Jordan, none of it compared to the day he returned to that same park in Stonewood. Same black Mercedes. Same parking spot. This time no sirens. No cuffs. No fear. Instead, children ran by playing tag. A group of black teenagers nodded at him in recognition. And off in the distance, an elderly white couple waved as they walked their dog. He sat on the same bench, opened the same leather-bound journal. But this time, he didn't write legal strategies or legislative goals. He wrote a letter to America. It read, "You saw me at my most vulnerable, and you stood with me. But don't just stand. Walk forward. Question the silence. Challenge the comfort. Know that real justice isn't loud. It's lasting. And that the badge, the robe, the title, mean nothing without humanity behind them." He closed the journal, looked out at the sun setting behind the treetops, and for the first time in a long while, Jordan Colton, Attorney General, black man, American citizen, felt hope not in the system, but in the people. Every traffic stop is a test of character, of restraint, of justice. Jordan Colton passed his with grace. But America, we're still being graded. What will we do next? Like, share, and subscribe to Black Echoes Global, where stories spark change.